It's 1840 and the city's population has exploded. There are people squeezed into every dark corner. Except for a few watchmen asleep in their wooden shacks, Manhattan has no central police force.
It was a pretty lawless town, and you definitely could be attacked at any point.
They were dangerous. You would be at the very least insulted, sometimes assaulted.
With the number of criminals on the rise, New York needed a great detective to stop them. His name was Thomas Byrnes.
Byrnes had a lot of talent. He was very smart.
He cultivated a network of informers, the way I think the FBI cultivates a network of informers on terrorists.
A generation later, a new terror appeared on the streets of Little Italy. It was called the Black Hand.
There was a time just on Elizabeth Street where perhaps as many as 20 bombs went off. I mean, imagine what that would be like today.
Joseph Petrosino is a hero. He understood the Black Hand. He understood the type of crime that they were capable of.
Great detectives win the battles that keep this city safe, but the war never ends.
And I said to him, Jeffrey, look, we'll do whatever it takes to protect you, but you need to help us. It led to the conviction of John Gotti and all the people involved in that case.
Who were New York City's legendary detectives and the sensational cases they tackled? Walk with me as we meet the crime solvers who took on some of the darker secrets of New York. '40s Manhattan, crowded, wealthy, but no central police force. New Yorkers still remembered the horrors of British occupation during the Revolutionary War.
It was so close after the Revolution that they really did fear a standing army. So there was a great fear of a police force at the same time that a police force was clearly necessary.
The city still depended on a system left over from Dutch New Amsterdam. After dark, there were 9 night watchmen and a handful of constables for a city of more than 300,000, which meant that if you weren't paying attention, you could literally be swallowed up by the city streets.
An officer named William Bell wrote in a diary. He's reporting things like a swamp in the Five Points that has claimed the lives of 5 or 6 people, where you just drown in the middle of the city. If you were a respectable person, you would not go to Corlear's Hook. You would not go to the Five Points. You would not go to any number of neighborhoods that were located downtown.
Too many wealthy businessmen were getting robbed and pressured the state legislature to create the city's first police force, mostly from newly arrived Irish immigrants. The Irish balked at wearing uniforms and were quickly replaced by a group of plainclothes officers who wore an 8-pointed badge made out of copper.
The Copper Stars were formed in 1845. They were gentlemen who walked rounds 16 hours a day for $10 a week with copper stars pinned to their civilian clothing. Previously, it had only been about, this crime has already happened, we have to fix it. But the improvement of the Copper Stars was that they were trying to prevent crime from happening in the first place. It was extremely, extremely important to the safety of the streets.
The Copper Stars kept the streets safe, quelling riots and keeping peace. But things changed after the Civil War, when a criminal could hop on a train and be in a brand new city the next day.
They had all kinds of traveling criminals. At the top were the confidence men. They looked, talked, and acted like gentlemen, and they made their living cheating rich people and cheating institutions. Then a step below that were the burglars. They were highly skilled craftsmen, especially those who could crack a safe.
By the 1870s, there were already detectives in New York City who handled different types of crime, but they weren't centrally organized. That would be the job of a young patrolman named Thomas Byrnes, who was making quite a name for himself.
He was big, he was rough, and he wasn't afraid to use his hands to get confessions or to get criminals in. There were no Miranda rights, and due process may have been in the Constitution, but it's not on the streets of New York.
Before Byrnes, police work was mostly a sense of find a witness or pound a confession out of somebody. But Byrnes actually made it more crime solving. I'd say Byrnes might even be the missing link to the modern FBI.
He developed a reputation as a tough, aggressive, smart, policeman, and at the age of 28, he was a captain of police.
Byrnes had his men keep diaries so he could keep track of the criminals they arrested, men and women alike. He started using photography as a way to identify and organize the city's underworld with descriptions of the type of crime they specialized in. Then, suddenly, in the fall of 1878, two shocking crimes made headlines. One of the crime scenes still remains from Thomas Byrnes' time, a secret hidden in the graveyard of Old St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. Under cover of darkness, grave robbers scaled the wall of this cemetery and broke into the crypt of multimillionaire A.T. Stewart. They stole his decomposing body and held it for ransom.
He was, I think at the time of his death, maybe the second richest man in America, and they wanted something like $250,000. Mrs. Stewart was not about to pay that kind of money.
After months of negotiating, the family struck a deal with the kidnappers.
Finally, it was decided that they would pay $20,000. A relative of Mr. Stewart in a wagon was told to drive out into Westchester, and he turned over the money and got the body. That, to me, looked more like an extortion than a robbery.
This body snatching was just one example of what seemed to be a wave of crimes by organized groups with no fear of the law.
Just 11 days earlier, the Manhattan Savings Institution had been robbed of nearly $3 million. The graveyard kidnapping appalled the city. The bank robbery left it stunned.
The Manhattan bank robbery was an enormous bank robbery. I mean, when you hear the number $2.7 million, you think, oh, that's not that much. Well, a workman made $1 a day. Now a workman makes $50 to $100 a day. So you take the $2.7 million, multiply by 50 to 100, and this was a $100 million bank robbery. I mean, these guys hauled out loot.
It wasn't just the amount the robbers got away with. It was the fact that they'd gotten in at all. The bank was a fortress on Bleecker Street and Broadway, where New York's elites stored their valuables. Even worse, the job was done right under Byrnes' nose.
The break-in at the Manhattan Savings Institution was the biggest bank robbery in American history, and it happened in the precinct that Captain Thomas Byrnes commanded. But Byrnes knew every gang in the city, and within days, he had his suspects lined up.
Okay, here we have the heavy boys of Inspector Byrnes' time. All of these are connected with a fellow named George Leslie. And George Leslie conceived the idea of hitting the Manhattan Savings Institute at Bleecker and Broadway.
This is a sophisticated, complex operation.
Very sophisticated. The gang included people like Johnny Dobbs, Worcester Sam Paris, Banjo Pete Emerson. These were the top burglars in the United States.
So, Tom, after the Manhattan Savings Bank robbery went down, Thomas Byrnes knew it was the Leslie gang?
Yes, it was the Leslie gang, but minus Leslie.
And why not George Leslie, for sure?
Well, George Leslie had a perfect alibi. He had been murdered 4 months earlier.
Leslie was having affairs with two of his gang members' wives. And one of them, probably the most dangerous, who was called Shang. So Shang found out that his wife was having an affair. His wife told Leslie to meet him.
He was either killed in Brooklyn and the body hauled to Yonkers, or they took him there and killed him there. But he was taken in a cart by a fellow named Eddie Geary or Eddie Goody, who was the best getaway cart driver in New York.
In 1870s New York, good getaway drivers could move a horse cart through city traffic faster than the police. Even stolen horses were a major part of the city's underworld economy.
Horses were incredibly valuable, and New York thieves stole more horses than the horse thieves in California or Texas, the entire state. And once they stole the horse, they needed to take it somewhere. So there were outlaw stables near Longacre Square where a guy could gallop in on a horse and they'd actually dye the horse's mane. And it's like chop shops for horses. You gotta love it.
6 months after George Leslie's murder, his gang went through with the robbery without him. They spent weeks practicing with a device called the Little Joker, which they placed inside the bank's safe to read the combination. That meant they needed an accomplice to let them in, so they paid off a night watchman named Patrick Shevlin.
Shevlin was the inside man, and Shevlin was promised $250,000 and got $1,200. So he was upset and he was ready to talk.
Byrnes was a very good interrogator. He understood the principles of psychology without ever having picked up a textbook. They told Shevlin, you're a fool. You only got $12,000 and they got $2 million and something. And Shevlin supposedly said, I only got $1,500.
And now he can manipulate the various criminals against each other. This one said that one told me this. You're going to do 30 years, he's going to do 10. And Byrnes was able to crack the case.
He became head of detectives. And then he was able to expand the detective department, which was not very large at the time.
Byrnes would spend 2 hours a day in saloons with a company of criminals just to get information. They drank whiskey while he drank soda water. He'd allow a thief to commit petty crimes in exchange for details on big heists. It was said that 6 men couldn't plan a robbery in New York without one of them being in Byrnes' pocket.
Byrnes knew that Wall Street was a target for the city's criminals, from confidence men who cheated big companies to pickpockets who lifted expensive jewelry in the streets. So in his first week as chief of detectives, he installed a police station on Wall Street with a new device called the telephone connected to every major brokerage house. An officer could be on the scene within 5 minutes.
Byrnes also set up the famous John Street Deadline, an imaginary boundary that ran river to river, guarded by policemen. Any ex-con found south of the line was arrested on site and taken to the Blackwell Island workhouse. It was brutal, and it was effective.
Byrnes' method absolutely worked. They could carry millions of dollars around Wall Street with no risk. Byrnes said that in the last 7 years, from 1880 to 1887, not a postage stamp worth 10 cents was taken in that area.
Delmonico's restaurant on historic Hanover Square holds a secret of New York from the city's Gilded Age. In this very room on a February evening in 1886, the New York Stock Exchange held a dinner in Byrnes' honor. Each table was filled with the rich and powerful, paying tribute to the man who had protected them from crime.
They gave him a pocket watch with the seal of the stock exchange inscribed on it. But what Byrnes' wealthy supporters had really given him was the power to change Manhattan's detective department forever.
Byrnes created the modern detective bureau. Detective bureaus that exist in American cities today still resemble Byrnes' Detective Bureau, a centralized force that handled the major cases. That is still the way detective bureaus are organized.
I think Byrnes does provide the link between the thug cop and, say, the modern FBI. He's a fascinating, smart, tough, methodical detective.
Thomas Byrnes retired in 1895, forced out by an ambitious New York City police commissioner named Teddy Roosevelt. Byrnes left behind a police department with modern organization and true investigative skill. They would soon need it.
A new breed of criminal was filtering into the city, hidden inside the waves of immigrants filling a chaotic, congested neighborhood known as Little Italy.
Life was constantly filled with danger. People in Little Italy saw people murdered. They saw people run over by horses and carriages. They saw kids drown in rooftop water towers. It was a rough time. And added to this was the terror of the Black Hand.
The Black Hand was a symbol of fear from the old country, used by independent gangs of criminals who preyed on their fellow immigrants. Letters demanding money would be stamped by a hand blacked with ink or a skull and dagger. No one was safe.
If you were part of New York's Italian community and had any money, it practically guaranteed you'd be the target of extortion. A letter would tell you where to leave the payment, by a statue in a park, even inside a confessional. And they meant business.
The Black Hand, La Mano Nera. Not a good thing. This was Italian on Italian crime. Street criminals that were preying upon other Italian immigrants coming into the United States. What they would do is they would send an extortion letter. When you got this letter, chills ran up and down your spine.
Trouble.
Absolutely. This one has skulls, both upside down and right side up, with daggers on top of them. And the letter is written in very, very bad Sicilian. Not even in Italian. But what they're doing is they're threatening to harm these two girls, who are my cousins. But this is what it says. Dirty bastard, damn pig, You will burn the face of your daughter, damn pig. You will find yourself with a guilty conscience, you dog. You must bring the money, otherwise we will make you weep bitter tears, and you will be responsible for the destruction of your family.
That is a very threatening letter, and it sounds very specific. Would these things have happened?
Oh, absolutely.
They followed through on their threats. My grandmother was kidnapped and she was returned alive. She was a rare case. Most of the children were killed who were kidnapped.
Most Italian families who got a letter from the Black Hand didn't go to the police, and there wasn't much effort to solve crime in immigrant neighborhoods. In 1900, almost no one in the NYPD could even speak Italian, but one officer was the exception, a short, tough Italian immigrant with a fondness for wearing derby hats named Joseph Petrosino.
Petrosino, he would walk around in disguise, pretending to be an immigrant just off the boat, and go around town getting information and spying on people.
Joe Petrosino was so skilled at working undercover and making arrests, he got promoted. When a body was found inside a wooden barrel on the Lower East Side, Petrosino was assigned to the case.
This was in 1903, and this lady was going through a vacant lot. She saw a jacket covering a barrel, and there was a mutilated body. The mutilation was such that it cannot be discussed on family television. Okay, they amputated a certain part and placed it in this guy's mouth. That's the sign he was a squealer. Petrosino was the lead detective on the case.
No one could identify the body inside the wooden barrel, but the barrel had sawdust and sugar in it, linking it to a cafe here at Elizabeth and Houston Streets. This old building dates back to a time when the Italian community stretched over 30 blocks.
Back in 1903, it was called the Star of Italy, a meeting place for gangsters, thugs, and killers. Even though he knew he'd be recognized, Petrosino walked inside. With his back against a wall, he ordered a drink. Playing cards in the back were Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo, leaders of a gang that specialized in counterfeiting and kidnapping. Petrosino gathered some sawdust from the cafe floor.
Like all good detectives, he noticed details, and he saw that the quality of the sawdust in the barrel matched the sawdust that was in the Star of Italy. And that attention to detail is what allowed him to solve that case and many others. There were more than 500 people put away over the course of his career, I believe.
The sawdust match led to a chain of evidence that ended with the arrest of the Morello gang. Petrosino personally escorted the suspected killer, a man nicknamed the Ox, in handcuffs through the streets. But within days, high-priced lawyers had sprung them out on bail, leaving Petrosino enraged at the American legal system, but more famous than ever.
The barrel murder is what put Giuseppe Petrosino on the map. It's what gained Teddy Roosevelt's attention, and eventually he was made lieutenant and put in charge of the Italian squad, which specifically was created to deal with Black Hand crime.
Petrosino actually created the bomb squad in New York City. He was the first. He created the bomb squad because the Black Handers, if you refused to pay, would blow up your business with dynamite.
The lieutenant and his detectives stopped a plot to kill the great Italian tenor, Enrico Caruso, and discovered 60 victims of the Black Hand buried at an old horse stable on 3rd Avenue. Whether it was a threat by a low-level thug or a top-level mobster, Petrosino took it personally.
There's the famous story of the head of the Camaro who came to New York, bragging he's going to get Petrosino. And Petrosino walks in to the social club he's in, beats him up, drags him outside of the club, down the street, won't let him get up. He drags him on the ground all the way to the police station, and then he gets him kicked out of the United States.
Petrosino's courage won him admirers and deadly enemies. One of them was the head of the Sicilian mafia, Don Vito Cascioferro, who had to leave America when Petrosino pursued him for the barrel murder.
For years, it was rumored that Don Vito kept a picture of Petrosino in his wallet, vowing to kill the police lieutenant with his own hands. The mobster would get his chance sooner than he expected.
A lot of the Italians who came to the United States had lied about having criminal records in Italy, which means they could be deported. So they decided to send Petrosino over there. while he was on the sea, the police commissioner said, Petrosino is on the way to Italy and Sicily. It appeared in the European edition of the Herald Tribune and in Italian newspapers.
Everybody knew he was coming. Lots of people wish he had turned around once he found out that his cover had been blown and come back, but he decided to go forward.
Less than 2 weeks into his trip, Petrosino was tipped off that a mafia informer would meet him in a darkened square in Palermo, Sicily. Instead, the lieutenant faced 3 bullets fired at point-blank range. The old mafia don Cascioferro claimed he killed Petrosino personally, although it's more likely that his assassins did the job. Back in New York, Petrosino's death stunned the city. In April 1909, the funeral mass for Joseph Petrosino filled the pews here at Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. More than 200,000 New Yorkers lined the procession to the cemetery. The mafia had ended the lieutenant's life, but they could not stop what he left behind.
I think Giuseppe Petrosino was the first to say, you know what, we can change culture. Culture's the hardest thing in the world to change, but this guy was brave enough to do that and to cross all the lines. And I think he proved to a lot of people, even though he was killed, that you could do that.
He's a hero. He's a hero for everybody who wants to be an American and wants to be living in the American way.
Joseph Petrosino remains the only NYPD officer killed overseas in the line of duty. It was the beginning of a long battle between the city's police department and organized crime. Detectives a century later are still protecting us from criminals who grew out of the era of the Black Hand.
Paul Castellano was the head of the Gambino crime family and probably the most powerful mobster in the United States.
Joe Brandifine had been in the NYPD 12 years before he became a detective in the Manhattan South Homicide Squad.
Homicide Squad, we covered from South Ferry, river to river to 59th Street. Any murder cases that happened in that area, we did them.
The most famous case occurred in December of 1985 when Paul Castellano was assassinated outside Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street.
So, Joe, where did the Castellano hit actually take place?
Took place right here at this curb.
So what happened? Describe the scene for me.
They pulled up their car. Paul Castellano opened the door, got his 2 feet on the sidewalk, and 2 guys ran up and shot him. And he kind of slid down, and his head came to rest on the floorboard. Tommy Bellotti got out the driver's side, and 2 guys ran at him and shot him, and he lay right in the middle of the street. He was shot.
So it was Castellano first, Bellotti was the second?
Yes.
And who ordered that hit?
John Gotti.
Why?
Well, John Gotti knew that some of his people in his crew were dealing drugs and that Castellano didn't like that. And he knew that Castellano would ultimately kill him and the people in his crew. And he decided to act first.
As Detective Brandifine went over the eyewitness accounts from the night of the murder, he realized that one of the witnesses had been right next to the killers.
This is where the witness was standing. Okay, it was 3 weeks before Christmas. The streets were crowded.
Lots of people.
Lots of people walking all around. The witness gave a statement, and in his statement he said that he saw a guy with patent leather shoes, spit-shine shoes, and a handgun. And later on, when we read this interview, I said to my boss, you know what, if a guy is that close to see that the guy's got patent leather shoes on and a handgun in his hand and it's pitch black out, I says he saw more than that.
But the witness left town when he realized the man he'd seen murdered was a mafia don. Brandifine tracked him all the way to Oregon.
Oh, he was deathly scared. I said, listen, Jeffrey, you can't tell me that you saw spit-shine shoes and a guy firing a gun and that you couldn't see his face. You were too close not to see the guy's face. He goes, no, I didn't see the guy's face.
Chief Inspector Byrnes and Lieutenant Petrosino would have told any modern-day detective that if you tap into the core of someone's character, you have the best shot at getting at the truth. Brandifine's instincts told him the same thing.
I always found that if you get to people's emotions and you get to their feelings, you can get them to talk to you. And I would tell him, I said, you know, Jeffrey, do you really want to live with this for the rest of your life, knowing that you saw who did this and you're just going to live like that? And finally he says, well, maybe I could identify somebody. And we showed him photos, and he picked out 2 of the shooters in that case.
It was the first time a civilian outside the mob had testified against organized crime. and it helped put Castellano's killers in jail.
I always found that if you take every case the same way, like, for instance, we used Paul Castellano murders, if some poor junkie got killed on the street, if you treat those both in the same way and give them both the same amount of work, because that person is still someone's daughter or son or uncle, and I always treated those cases the same. I always put as much work into the smaller case as I did the bigger case.
Most detectives are craftsmen. That is, they learn the skill on the job from experience. But there are some people who have a certain innate ability that makes them natural detectives. And you're born with that.
Just as the Copper Stars patrolled the streets before the Civil War, New York City's detectives used the same skill and courage to keep us safe a century and a half later. This city is filled with unsolved secrets. All you have to do is look for them.